Welcome back, I'm Kimberly and this is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series, where we supply our AI, DesignEye, with a couple of images of designs and ask it to give us some feedback based on the principles and elements of design. This week we've got Mulga's bicycle and an impose design that was for a country music awards night, and this was for the entryway to the award area. So let's have a look at these two designs and I'll give you a bit of a description of how I put them together and what I was thinking at the time before we look at what DesignEye has got to tell us about the designs. This is Mulga's bicycle. It was a floor-based design, so on a stand that is supplied 1 metre square at the base and 1.8 metres in height, and we need to use about 2/3 of that space. So we can have it freestanding. Can't attach anything to the backing board, but you can have a structure that gives you a background that isn't the grey if you want to. So Mulga's bicycle is actually a poem, an Australian poem, and it talks about this fellow who rides his bike everywhere and then on one day crashes through the bush down into a creek at the end of it. So what I wanted to depict was that coming down the hill and crashing through the bush. It is a day on this competition where we have to use Australian native plant material, so that's why I have used that material that you can see there. It's based on a structure that has Hebel blocks, so the lightweight concrete blocks with some plastic pipe in them that gives me the structure that I can hang everything else off, and those parts of it I have painted in the same colour as the backing board so that they blend in with the backing board and you don't see them as clearly. I managed to get an old damaged bike rim from a bicycle shop, and I have used that at the top of the design and repeated that with rings of bark as though the wheels are coming through the bush and going to hit the creek at the bottom. And I've just put plant material within those rings as though it's been caught up as the bike's been crashing down the hill, and the vertical placement is Gymea lily leaves and woolly bush that I have tried to use to depict the trees that the bike is coming through as it comes down the hill and into the creek. So let's see now what DesignEye has got to tell us about this particular design. Looking at line, first of all, the design incorporates both organic and structural lines. The circular form of the bicycle wheel contrasts with the flowing natural lines of the plant material. So that's good because I need to have both organic and structural lines in it, and it hasn't, in looking at the image, mentioned the structural support at the back, so that's a good thing that is blending with the background. The shape, the dominant shape is the circle, representing the bicycle wheel. The surrounding plant material creates irregular organic shapes that add interest and complexity whilst still maintaining that circular form. So both the idea and the intent have been carried through, which is good. So the three-dimensional form is emphasised by the depth created through layering different elements such as the wheel, branches and foliage. Sometimes it's quite hard to give yourself the right depth in a design when you're working in such a big area, and essentially you're working at eye height, but you've got to work below eye height and you've got to give some sort of dimension, three-dimensional representation in your design. And the tendency when we're early in our careers is to focus on a structure and working around a structure rather than thinking about the depth of the space that you've got to use. For texture, a variety of textures are present from the smooth metal of the wheel to the rough fibrous plant materials. This contrast enhances the tactile quality of the design, the quantity as well, of the design. So it is important in these designs to give yourself a variety of textures, and it can be difficult because you've got such a smooth, large area that is the background, the staging area. And my dilemma, of course, was that using the bark would mean that there was a lot of rough texture in the design, and so I needed to ensure that there was a smooth contrast as well, and that's what I've done with that very tall vertical Gymea lily leaf on the left-hand side. The colour palette is natural and earthy with browns, greens and yellows. This aligns well with the Australian theme and adds to the rustic feel of the piece. You'll hear a little bit later that I could have used other plant material that might have made it a bit brighter, but essentially the Australian bush is these colours, and so I was thinking more about my interpretation of the poem and that crashing through the bush, and what he might see from his bike would only be this blur of brown and green and a little bit of yellow. The design uses negative space effectively, particularly within the circle of the wheel. This open space helps to balance the denser areas of foliage and materials. So I can see that might be a problem. The space used with the lower circle, I've got a lot of bark on that, and so it's quite a dense grouping of the bark, and I might, in hindsight, I might have loosened that a little bit and given it a bit more space in that lower area as well as the upper area where the actual bicycle wheel is. The design achieves a balance through the circular form of the wheel and the asymmetrical placement of the plant materials. The vertical element on the left adds stability. So that's good because that's the idea that I wanted, but apart from the idea, it's actually giving the design some balance, and that's important. There is a strong contrast between the man-made bicycle wheel and the natural plant materials. This juxtaposition highlights the theme and adds visual interest. So that's good. Once again, there's contrast not just in the textures, but in the elements that are being depicted within the design. The circular wheel serves as the focal point, drawing the viewer's eye. The surrounding materials guide the eye around the composition, emphasising the central element. Probably not as good as I would have liked. I would have liked to have seen you run through the design. So yes, see the wheel, but understand that that was part of the whole of the design, not just look at the wheel and see that there's stuff around it. Rhythm is created through the repetition of circular shapes and the flow of plant materials. The viewer's eye is led from one element to another, creating a sense of movement. That's true, but I would like to see more movement in it because my depiction is very much about the movement within this activity that's happening in the poem, and so I feel that it actually needs more movement, more implied movement in the design. Let's see when we get to the end, what the suggestions are. The cohesive use of natural materials and a consistent colour palette unify the design. The thematic reference to Mulga Bill's bicycle ties all the elements together. So that's a good result in terms of the unity of the design. There's nothing that's standing out and jarring you. I run the risk with that vertical placement of that looking like it's out of place, but because I've repeated the material and the colour in other parts of the design, there's still some unity with that element that's vertically placed there. The proportions are well considered, with the larger wheel balanced by the smaller detailed plant materials. The vertical element adds height and dimension. And that's good because the proportion and scale in these designs can often be tricky. We tend to look at our plant materials and we might be used to using them on the bench, so we have in our brain a better idea of proportions and size for a 70 centimetre bench design than we do for something that is a metre square and 1.8 metres tall. We have to think differently about grouping plant material together to get the proportions and the scale right in that kind of a design. So let's see some suggestions for improvement. What we want to see with the following suggestions: that there's greater visual impact, better convey the theme of Mulga Bill's bicycle, and maintain structural integrity for a more polished and dynamic presentation. And that's probably what I would like. I would like it to be more dynamic than it is presenting in these images and the way I felt when I put it together, which is a few years ago now. So, enhance movement. So there you go. Introduce more elements that suggest movement, such as wispy grasses or hanging elements to further convey the dynamic quality of a bicycle. And I think that that's a very good suggestion. I think I should have had things that were hanging still within the circular motion, and then the wispy grasses hanging off the wheels or hanging in parts of the design, even inside the wheels, but not fully, because we know that negative space works, would have enhanced the movement that is implied and actual in the design. Add colour variations. Incorporate additional colours to create more visual interest. Using flowers with brighter hues could draw more attention and add vibrancy. That's a suggestion that I would look at, but as I said earlier, I need to know that, number one, that I'm using Australian plant materials, and there are brighter colours that you can get, but it would be, it's trying to stick to the pure interpretation of the theme and thinking about Mulga Bill and where the poem was written and where they're talking about geographically, and thinking about the plant material that would be there. And that's probably too deep an interpretation for this design, but that's how my mind works. Strengthen the theme. Include more elements directly related to the poem Mulga Bill's bicycle, such as small bicycle parts or Australian native flowers, to reinforce the narrative. And I think that that's a very good idea. I focused so much on the bike and the bike wheel that I haven't added. See, I could have, towards the bottom, I could have a set of handlebars that had come off the bike. It would enhance the interpretation of the theme, and I could have plant material stuck to it, wrapped around it, and it just adds another element. Whereas at the moment there's just this one bicycle wheel, and it's subtle reference where everything else I'm trying to bombard the judges with my interpretation of the theme. Increase the depth. Add layers to the design to increase depth and complexity. This could be achieved by positioning some elements closer to the viewer and others further back. So it is angled, and it's probably a little bit difficult to see in the image, but there was a reasonable amount of depth in the design. I could probably have more. I could probably have had another vertical placement towards the back of the design, and that would have just, apart from giving me the repetition and a bit of colour at the back of the design in the green leaf, it would have enhanced that feeling of depth, because we'd be looking through the design to this placement that is at the back of the design. So all very good suggestions. Let's now look at our second design, which was an imposé. Our second design is an imposé, as I said, and the theme that we were given 15 minutes before we started the competition was that we had to provide an entryway for a country music awards celebration. So the elements that we were given, you can see in the design, there was a roll of bamboo matting, fencing type stuff, and then boxes of Australian native plant material, and a couple of stands that were painted grey, so needed to be covered up a little bit. The space allowed is 2 metres square and 2 metres tall, so it's a cube. It's an odd shape to be using in a design, because naturally we like to have our 2/3 of the space and have a little bit of 358 happening. So you have to start to think about how you're going to fill that space and still keep the proportions right. With this competition, we are required to use 80% of the material that is supplied, and the material that we don't use we have to leave on the bench so that the judges can see how much we have actually used of what was supplied. Everyone, as is always with an imposé, everyone gets exactly the same material to use. And we have 3 hours to put the design together. For this design, I thought I wanted it to make it as though we were being funneled through the doors of the area that was being used for the Country Music Awards. And so I've used the 2 supplied timber structures. They were oblong, and I've put one on its side so to give me some height in the design, and the other I've left as the trough, the way it was presented to us on the other side, so it provides us with that lower entry way, and use the matting over to cover the actual timber box that was supplied, and then drape that down over the floor and cut the edge so that it looks like we're going through. There were bark chips supplied, so I've used that as a pseudo carpet around the base and to the entry into the door. And on the upright, the vertical placement, I've got a bucket behind some of the bamboo that I've cut off to cover that structure as well, and wrap that around it. And then I've used the box that the material came in and cut out some musical notes to glue onto it so that it was obvious. And then both the arrangements with the plant material I have just made as semi-formal designs that are often seen in these sorts of reception areas and hotel reception areas and other reception areas. So one is a long placement that is just designed to be bright and cheery, and the one on top of the vertical placement is a more formal one, but it's got some leaves and branches hanging down to give me that sense of the height of where it is. So let's see what DesignEye has got to say, bearing in mind that it won't know that everybody got the same material to use. So some of the suggestions that it might give would be things that you would think about if you're putting the design together yourself rather than what is supplied in the box. With line, first of all, the design incorporates vertical and horizontal lines, particularly with the tall wooden panel and the bamboo-like flooring. These lines create structure and guide the viewer's eyes. So this is exactly what I needed. I needed structure because it was an entryway, and I wanted your eyes to be drawn through to where you had to walk between these two lots of plant material. The dominant shapes are the musical notes attached to the wooden panel, which are symbolic and thematic. The overall rectangular shapes of the elements add stability. Bit of a shame, really, that the cardboard is a plant-based product, and so it got judged that way. But to have that as the dominant shape is a little bit disappointing. I'd obviously needed to make it look more like people were being channeled into the design, and to have those arrangements of the plant material a little bit more spectacular in their presentation, so that they were the bits that drew your eye to the design. The form, three-dimensional form, is emphasised by the arrangement of the floral materials on the panel and the ground, creating depth and volume. So the form was good, if not the actual way that the focal area was being emphasised. The textures, a variety of textures are present, from the rough natural wood and bamboo to the soft delicate flowers and foliage. This contrast adds interest and engages the viewer's sense of touch. So that's very true. There was a lot of textures that we were able to use, and it's good to be able to put them into a design without having to think about whether you've got that variety of textures in the material that you've thought about providing yourself. So I think in terms of the people putting the impose materials together, they've done a good job in selecting what materials they would give us so that we did have a variety of textures. The colour palette is earthy and natural, with greens, browns and pops of colour from the flowers. These colours align well with the country music theme and create a warm, welcoming atmosphere. So once again, I think that all credit has to go to the people who put the contents of the packs together, and that we were able to, as competitors, we were able to use the colour palette without having to think too much about whether it was appropriate for what we were doing. The design uses negative space effectively, particularly in the open area on the right side. This open space helps balance the denser areas of floral arrangement and allows the eye to rest. It does use space well. I think it could use it better. I think when I look at this now, I think what I should have done is angled the lower horizontal placement so that it was coming across the matting at the bottom, so that it drew your eye into a funnel, I guess, so that you knew that that was where you were going, that's where you were heading. To my mind, there's a little bit too much space in the design, negative space as well as positive space, and I would like to see that filled out a little bit more. The design achieves a sense of balance through the asymmetrical placement of the floral arrangements. The tall vertical panel on the left is balanced by the shorter, more spread out arrangement on the right. And that's good, because that's what I needed to have. I needed to have that balance with the plant materials. Otherwise, with a space that large, you run the risk of having it lopsided and having too much space. And I think I'm probably pushing the edge of too much negative space in this design, but we'll say that it's balanced because we've been told it's balanced. Contrast. There is a strong contrast between the structured man-made elements, the wooden panel and bamboo flooring, and the organic flowing forms of the plant material. This contrast highlights the natural beauty of the flowers, and that's excellent because I really did want to focus on the flowers And I felt, having been provided with this bamboo matting, and that was the comment from a lot of the other competitors afterwards, is that how are we going to minimise the impact of that, because it's smooth and there's not a lot of other rough textures that we could give as contrast. But what I've managed to do in this is contrast those man-made elements, so the bamboo and the wooden structures, with the amount of plant material and the placement of the plant material that's given it a different, more natural look. So I have done well in that bit. The musical notes on the wooden panel serve as a focal point, drawing the viewer's eye. The floral arrangements around the panel emphasise these focal points and enhance the thematic connection to country music. Yeah, as I said earlier, I'm not happy with the emphasis. I would like the emphasis to be on the floral, the plant material arrangements, rather than that one element that I cut out of a cardboard box. But that's just my head saying, all he did was cut it out of the box. It's not really part of the beautiful material that was supplied for the design itself. Rhythm is created through the repetition of lines and shapes, particularly with the bamboo flooring and the vertical lines of the wooden panel. This repetition guides the viewer's eye through the composition. And I think that's true. I think I have achieved a good rhythm in the design, and there's repetition in the content of the two floral arrangements that are in the design, and that is only separated by that bamboo in the middle. The cohesive use of natural materials and a consistent colour palette unify the design. The thematic reference to country music ties all elements together and creates a harmonious composition. That, once again, I think, yes, it's unified, but I would like to see it a bit more unified than it is. I still feel like that bamboo flooring in the middle there is separating the two sides of it, and it's not as unified as I would like it. And I think if I had angled that horizontal placement a little bit more towards the centre of the backboard, that it would have brought it all together a little bit better for me. The proportions are well considered, with the taller panel balanced by the lower, more expansive arrangement on the ground. The different heights add dimension and interest, and that's good because we needed to ensure that proportion and scale were managed in this design. It is always hard in this design because, as I said earlier, it's this square, this cube that you have to fill. It is challenging to get the proportions right, knowing what plant material you've got and the sizes of the plant material. So you always have to, in these designs I find I always have to group and mass things to get that proportion of plant material against the scale of the space that we're using. So let's now see what DesignEye can suggest to us for some improvements. Enhance the movement. Introduce elements that suggest movement, such as cascading foliage or hanging elements, to add dynamism and lead the viewer's eye through the design. Now, that's a good suggestion. I have got some, as I mentioned very early on, I've got some of the branches of the gum leaves hanging down, and I should have made more of them, and I should have made them more obvious, so that there was not just the two that are hanging down in front of the vertical placement, but had them all the way around that. So there was really some element of movement that led us around that vertical placement, and we felt like there was movement and a bit of dynamic happening. Incorporate additional colours to create more visual interest. Using flowers with brighter hues could draw more attention and add vibrancy, particularly around the musical notes. That's probably true, and perhaps with the plant material that I had, I could have highlighted those musical notes by having the plant material around it, underneath it, through it. Some of that Australian plant material doesn't need a water source, so I could easily have done that. And it's more a suggestion for if you were doing this sort of a design where you were choosing your own plant material rather than using what was provided, because obviously there was no colour variation other than what I've used. So perhaps I could have thought about how I was using the colours that were provided, making sure that there was variation across the design in the colours that were provided. Strengthen the theme. Include more elements directly related to country music, such as small instruments or cowboy-themed decorations, to reinforce the narrative and enhance the thematic connection. And that's a suggestion, once again, because it's an impose, we can only use what we're provided with. But I did use the cardboard box to make those musical notes, and so I could have done other things to make it more obviously music. I know that one of the other competitors used the bamboo flooring and cut out a guitar as the centrepiece for her design. So there were, within what we were provided, there were obviously opportunities for me to have more reflection on the theme than I have done in this particular case. Increase depth. Add layers to the design to increase depth and complexity. This could be achieved by positioning some elements closer to the viewer and others further back, creating a more immersive experience. And I think that that's what angling that lower horizontal design across a little bit more towards the centre of it, so making it more a diagonal placement, would give me that depth perception more so than looking at it as a line that follows the line of the bamboo and just draws you back to that blank wall at the back. So yes, there's depth, but there's no depth perception by looking at it that way. So just changing that angle slightly will give you a greater sense of depth. And that's something that happens often on the bench as well, that we have a tendency, because we think it's going to be judged from the front, we should place our design so that it is flat facing towards the judge, where angling it a little bit might give you that extra bit of depth that you need for your design, whether it's implied or actual. So there we have our two designs for this week: Mulga Bill's bicycle and the Country Music Awards impose. As always, we encourage you to submit your own designs so that you can have them analysed and you can get these kind of suggestions for improving your designs. You just go straight to the website and upload an image, and within about 24 hours you'll have some feedback about your design. It is reviewed by a human as well, just to make sure that it's in a format that will be helpful to you in your floral art journey. But for now, I will leave you with those thoughts. I'm Kim Bailey. This is Floral Art Online, the Designs Dissected series.